welcome to Checkmate Tutoring's free lesson on Wilfred Owen's exposure, suitable for students in England and Wales studying the AQA specification GCSE in English literature. However, various examination boards may use this poem in their anthologies, and if so, the skills covered in this lesson will be transferable. The learning question for today's session is, can I begin to develop the skills necessary to analyse a group of poems in the way required to successfully answer a GCSE style poetry question? Now obviously, if this is the first Checkmate tutoring video you've looked at on poetry, you won't yet be able to analyse a group of poems. However, the aim is, and indeed there will be a session dedicated to, writing a comparative essay that does exactly this. You will be able to comparatively write about 2 poems from the conflict cluster of the AQA GCSE anthology if you complete all the necessary lessons and tasks in this series. Now, if we look at the success criteria along the bottom of the screen in red, yellow and green text, you will see how we are going to accomplish this. Talking specifically about exposure then, a student making essential progress will define what the term exposure means and use this to deduce what the poem is likely to be about. A student making expected progress will define what exposure means and use this and other ideas that they may have to articulate how Owen feels about war, and the First World War specifically. And a student making impressive progress will use both the definition and what they believe Owen felt about the war in an extended piece of writing that may serve as an introduction to an essay on this poem. Okay, straight away then, please read the resource entitled Life in the Trenches and complete the activities on the bottom of the sheet, either in your notebooks or on the computer. Remember, if you're a subscriber to Checkmate Tutoring Service and are accessing this lesson through the website, you will need to type your response so it can be marked and returned to you. In any case, please remember to write your answers in full sentences and include the subject of each sentence in your writing. Honestly, when your teachers go on at you about writing in this way, there is a valid reason. Full sentences are the difference between a decent set of notes that you can revise from and achieve exam success, and quite frankly, a useless set of notes that you can't. This task should take you no longer than 15 minutes, and so I'll see you back here then with the answers. Question 1. Fatalistic means that you believe you don't have any control over the outcome of something and that the result is predetermined. Fatalism is normally seen as a negative concept, and you might often hear people being described as having a fatalistic attitude. For example, some of your friends might say, "What is the point of me revising? I'm going to fail anyway." If they do, that is a fatalistic attitude, as they believe there is nothing they can do to prevent themselves from failing. On the other hand, fatalism is often seen in people's belief systems. For example, if someone has died, you might have heard people close to them saying God called him or her, or it was his or her time. Thus, there is nothing that could be done to prevent this from happening. Question 2. British and French trenches were worse because they were literally built in mud. Soldiers would use shovels and picks to create them. They had no protection from the weather, no electricity or running water, and therefore they were far worse than the German trenches. Question 3. The British and French thought that World War I would be over by Christmas 1914, and this was a major reason why they didn't build better trenches for themselves. Question 4. Soldiers spent most of their time cleaning weapons and equipment, trying to stay warm and dry, and in many cases, as the time before they were to launch an attack on the enemy drew closer, they became very anxious. A lot of the time was also spent being bored. Question 5. Little progress was made by either side during World War I, because they were using modern weapons but almost medieval tactics to try and fight the war. As soon as they realised that they were getting mowed down by machine gun fire, they retreated to the trenches, and then a defensive war started in which soldiers effectively hid from enemy gunfire and tried to launch attacks on heavily fortified enemy trenches. This was often ineffective, and even when it was, the gains one side made one day could be vanquished the next when the enemy attacked you again. It was effectively a war of attrition, which meant that the ultimate victor was the one who could afford to lose the most soldiers. Okay, using either a paper-based dictionary or by opening another tab in your browser, please find out what term exposure means and write this in your own words in your notes. Some of you might be able to work out, if you have any knowledge of World War I from Key Stage 3 history or even primary school, the best definition to note down, as there might be several different ones. So try and choose the one that you think fits the best, and I will be back to discuss the answer in 3 minutes. Okay, so as you can see, the definition that would be the most sensible to use here would be the state of having no protection from something harmful. For example, if you're exposed to the elements, you're exposed to the really bad weather, and this will have a really bad effect on your body. Now, please remember that you can get exposure to extremes of weather. It doesn't necessarily have to be freezing cold weather or roasting hot, but extremes of temperature are significant. So if your definition is wildly different to the one that is displayed here, please adjust your notes accordingly, and we will continue again in 2 minutes. Okay, please read the resource entitled Blizzards and Hypothermia and complete the activities on the bottom of your sheet, either in your notebooks or on the computer. Remember, if you're a subscriber to the Checkmate Tutoring Service and are accessing this lesson through their website, you will need to type your response so that it can be marked and returned to you. Again, please write in full sentences for the reason that have already been explained, and I'll see you again in 15 minutes when we'll go through the answers together. Okay, the answers to the questions are as follows. Question 1. Any answer around 54 kilometres per hour would be acceptable. Question 2. Freezing air and warm air have to meet each other. Anyone that remembers their Key Stage 3 geography lesson might remember a teacher talking about cold and warm fronts, and these are exactly what are involved here. Question 3. Heavy snow and howling winds are caused when these two weather fronts meet. Question 4. The extremely cold temperature is likely to kill those stuck in a blizzard. Question 5. Your body's core temperature only has to drop 4 degrees for hypothermia to set in. It doesn't sound like a lot, but yep, it's true. That is why sometimes you hear of those terrible cases of people walking home a little bit drunk after Christmas parties, perhaps getting lost, and then ultimately perishing because they have become hypothermic. And finally, then, question 6. Your breathing, heart rate and brain function all slow down if you become extremely hypothermic, and it is very life-threatening. Now, given the knowledge you have gained about what exposure means and the effects of hypothermia on the body, I want you to look through the statements that are displayed here and write down the ones that you think are likely to reflect what Wilfred Owen's exposure is likely to be about and the general mood of the poem. We will resume again in 5 minutes. Okay guys, so it's important to note that we haven't even read the poem yet, but that you should be able to make the following inferences from what you have read and the activities you've completed. The poem is going to be about soldiers fighting in freezing conditions, in which the weather kills them slowly and painfully. Indeed, we might say that the soldiers are exposed to the extremely cold weather, and it is this exposure that is killing them. And finally, it can be inferred that the poet hates war and tries to demonstrate how pointless and painful it is for the soldiers that waste their lives fighting. However, there are two key things here that we are going to learn about later. It is the concept of waste or wasting one's life, and whether or not these soldiers actually do much fighting with the enemy soldiers or not. In fact, those students hoping to achieve grades in 7, 8 and 9 range might want to look at some of Owen's other poems, Disabled and Anthem for Doomed Youth, in which the sense of waste and futility is developed further. Owen really despairs about how the youth on both sides of the conflict sacrifice their lives pointlessly and either die or suffer terrible injuries that change how they live after the war, and how it is all pretty much a conflict that they don't understand.
Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. But nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more, in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens. Pale flakes, with fingering stealth, come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath we lie out here. Therefore we're born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pours over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens.
Okay, so hopefully you should have highlighted some of these lines on your copy of the poem. If you haven't, please do so now and add notes to the side of these highlights as I discuss them. In verse 1 we have the line, merciless iced east winds that knife us. You should definitely highlight this and annotate it with something about how the wind is personified given the intent to stab the men. Note that it is not the enemy that is stabbing the soldier here, but the weather. Think about the verb knife here and the concept of stabbing. Blades are very thin and quite easily penetrate clothes unless the soldiers are wearing body armour, which incidentally they're not. Therefore, there is a sense of helplessness here. They cannot protect themselves from the wind that manages to penetrate their clothes and attack them. The last thing I want to talk about in verse 1, but it is something that appears 3 more times as a concluding line to verses 3, 4 and 8, is the statement, "but nothing happens." This is an extremely significant line, not only because it is repeated, but because as the poem progresses, and so does the soldiers' time in the trenches, nothing meaningful happens. There is no combat with the enemy, no talk of conversations the men were having, or the food they were eating. There is nothing but the weather constantly eroding their morale and beginning to kill them. Moving on to verse 2 then. We hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire. Okay, so to understand this, you need to know a bit more about the trenches the soldiers were living in. The battlefield was littered with barbed wire, which stretched all the way along the top of the trenches in an effort to repel enemy attack. However, whilst this was quite effective, in windy conditions the wire would blow out and make strange noises, almost like how a slinky spring does. This was quite harrowing for the soldiers because often enemy soldiers would get caught up in the wire and die, so those in the trenches perhaps thought that the wire was haunted and talking to them, especially at night. Again, in verse 2, the 2 concluding lines of "far off, like a dull rumour of some other war" and "what are we doing here?" are really both significant. If we consider that we already know that nothing happens, because we've been told this is perhaps reinforced with the idea that even though the soldiers can hear the artillery fire in the distance, it is almost insignificant to them. It is part of the same war that they are in, but they aren't fighting it. They are just sitting around. This idea is then compounded when the question is asked, "What are we doing here?" I don't think this is a rhetorical question for the benefit of the reader. Instead, the soldiers that are in this situation are asking this question of themselves. They are day after day and night after night sitting in a trench getting soaked and cold, have seen no fighting, yet are dying in a totally pointless fashion. Verse 3. The depressing mood is amplified further when Owen states, "The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow." Usually dawn is supposed to be seen as a positive thing, the beginning of a new day in which positive things can happen. However, in this scenario, as the soldiers realise it is dawn, they become more miserable, probably because they know they are stuck in the continuous and hopeless cycle of trying to keep warm and free from the awful conditions they continue to be in. We only know that rain soaks and clouds sag stormy. This is a really powerful sentence, as the verb phrase, "we only know," suggests that the soldiers are preoccupied with attempting to keep warm and dry in really difficult conditions. That is all they can do. Watch out for the weather, which seems to be constant rain and grey clouds, which are obviously the prelude to more rain. Notice how there is no mention of fighting the enemy here, and that therefore already a picture is building up of soldiers being attacked by the weather with the verb knife in verse 1. And then the preoccupation with the weather in verse 3. So nothing is happening yet, and they are getting wet and cold repeatedly. The weather is personified again, but almost as a huge army. Dawn massing in the east, a melancholy army. Attack once more in the ranks on shivering ranks of grey. Here again a reference could be made to the pending attack by the army soldiers, but I think it's far more likely that it is the weather that is being portrayed as the biggest enemy. It is incessant and constantly wears down the soldiers, who are attacked on all sides by cold and wet weather, soaking through their uniforms, making them shiver, ultimately giving them hypothermia and making some of them freeze to death. Moving on, verse 4, the first line, "Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence," has a certain sibilant quality. This is the most action or excitement that the men in the trenches have likely had for ages. It breaks the monotony, but only momentarily, as we are immediately told that these bullets are less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. Here you have the biggest clue to Owen's belief that the weather is more of a threat than enemy soldiers. The air is full of snow, perhaps there is a blizzard, and it is these snowflakes that are more deadly than the enemy bullets that were just mentioned. Not only this, but notice the verb phrase flock, pause and renew. This again might suggest that the weather is personified, and like the melancholy army mentioned in verse 3, perhaps this is almost seen as a tactic the snow has developed to hurt the men sitting in the trenches as much as possible. In verse 5, the weather is discussed in a malevolent personified light again, as the snowflakes are described as feeling for our faces. Therefore, it is clear that Owen is suggesting that the snow is deliberately attacking the exposed parts of the body, i.e. the soldiers' faces. Then something strange happens. It is almost as if the soldiers are beginning a series of hallucinations in which, as they cringe into holes, attempting shelter from the weather, they start to visualise snippets from their past lives in which they are transported back to the countryside in England, an almost an idealistic existence. This is continued in verse 6. In verse 6, it's almost like the soldiers are in grasping distance of being at home in the beautiful setting, perhaps sitting around a fire and listening to the sound of crickets. However, just as suddenly as the nice image of hope is created, it is torn away again as the shutters and doors are all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Here it is more obvious that the soldiers were hallucinating, and they are thrust back into the battlefield where they are dying in the cold and awful conditions they were always in. In the penultimate verse, the soldiers seem to lose faith in God and or Christianity. Perhaps everything that soldiers once believed in or thought to be true is now not important. They have been thrust back into the realisation that they are dying, barred from entering the homes of their memories, and they realise that even God cannot save them from their death. Finally, in verse 8, tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. I think this is the biggest single indication that the weather has killed or is going to kill the soldiers in the trenches. It will shrivel hands and pucker foreheads crisp. It could be argued that if snow landed on your forehead, you could wipe it away if you could, so as to keep warm. The fact that nothing is mentioned about the soldiers brushing it away suggests that they are dead or very close to it, as they lack the strength to do this. Okay, so if you haven't seen this table before, please listen carefully. If you have, please feel free to skip forward to the timestamp listed below, unless you need to refresh your memory. This table details a method that can be used to help structure your thought process when taking notes on poems, and furthermore, it can also help structure a basic answer. It isn't the only method of planning or developing an answer, and in fact, English teaching is awash with acronyms that are there to guide you. You don't have to use this method, but for the purpose of this unit, and for checkmate tutoring in general, this is the method that will be used. So in a moment, you are going to create your own table with focused information on the poem exposure. Obviously, before you can do this, you need to know what needs to be put into each segment of the table. In the content section, you should be considering what is the story of the poem, what happens in the poem, and what characters are involved. Now, not all poems have characters. Some talk about love or any number of things in an abstract way. Therefore, if a question is not relevant, then please feel free to not try and answer it. However, like a novel, there is always some sort of narrative in a poem, so try and identify the story and write it down. As you complete this task for each of the poems, you will get better and better at this. But at first, if you are analysing Ring a Ring a Roses, for example, you wouldn't be wrong if you wrote in the context box. The poem is about a group of people that are dancing around in a ring. They have posy flowers in their pockets, they sneeze, and they all fall down. Moving on to the theme section. In here you should write what the implied meaning of the poem is. Generally, this could be considered to be what the poet's attitudes are to the thing that is being discussed in the poem. You could think of this being the extension of a genre of a novel. Using the Ring a Ring a Roses example again, you could write in here that even though this is nursery rhyme sung by children, it relays the story of what happened to otherwise healthy children if they caught the plague during the 16th century. They start off as healthy, they have the posies to keep the plague away, yet they still catch it, develop symptoms, sneezing, and die. The mood section is simple to address. And you just need to consider your answer to 3 main questions. What do you think is the mood of the poet as he or she is writing the poem, and why? What do you think is the mood of the main character or protagonist in the poem, and why? And what mood do you think the poet is trying to make the reader feel? The last question isn't difficult, but even if you are not affected by the poem in a particular way other than you feel bored, you have to look at this from the standpoint of if how they tried to make you feel was effective. Continuing with the Ring a Ring of Roses then, you could write something like, the mood of the poem is quite sombre, as it is clear that the implied message that children were once happily playing are suddenly dead. As children are seen as a symbol of innocence, this is arguably all the more saddening. In the structure section, it's important that you don't just feature spot. It is totally redundant and pointless to say the poem has 10 lines and 2 verses. You should only mention a feature if you can explain how that particular feature impacts meaning. Structural devices include the rhyme scene, number of verses or lines, and line length. Taking into consideration what I've just said, there isn't much you could say about Ring a Ring of Roses, but what you do say must be relevant. So I would say something along the lines of, the poem is written in rhyming couplets. Each line rhymes, and it is designed like this so that it is both engaging for children and easy to remember. In the final section, which is language, again is important not to feature spot, but you need to comment on the linguistic or poetic devices that are used in the poem and how they affect meaning. For example, it serves absolutely no purpose to say in line 3 there is a simile, or the poet uses a metaphor. You need to comment on the impact of that simile or metaphor on the overall meaning of the poem. To conclude our analysis of Ring a Ring of Roses, we could say the metaphorical language in line 1, where the group of children dancing whilst linking hands in a circular motion, suggests initial vibrancy and health, as rosy cheeks are seen as a symbol of healthy children. This makes their death all the more horrible in the next few lines. So you are now going to complete the table taking into consideration the relevant aspects of content, themes, mood, structure and language for the poem exposure. Remember to apply what you were taught about not just feature spotting and try to make your comments relevant. Also remember that you will get better over time, so just a few sentences, if this is the first time you have completed this task, will be fine. You should take 20 minutes to complete this task, so we will go through some possible responses in 20 minutes. Okay, so I hope you have got some relatively detailed notes in your tables. However, as I said previously, if you're fairly new to this process, don't worry if you haven't written as much as you'd hoped. If necessary, you can add to your notes as I go through the various sections. So firstly, content. In the content section, you'll remember you need to summarise the story of the poem. However, you are not expected to write a line-for-line account, so something like what is written here would be sufficient, because as we know, the poem is about soldiers suffering from extreme exposure to cold weather. They are slowly dying from hypothermia, and even though they are entrenched on the battlefield in World War I, hardly any fighting is going on, and as such, their deaths and descent into death is pointless. Moving on to the theme section, and this is where, if you have some familiarity with Owen's other poems, you can really sound like you know what you're talking about here. Owen questions the validity of the soldiers being here in this environment. It would be bad enough if they were fighting for a cause they didn't really understand, having been duped by the propaganda machine at home. However, the fact that they're effectively sitting in a trench whilst the war seems to be going on in the distance really hints at the futility of their inevitable death. They are literally sitting around, exposed to the elements, getting closer and closer to death. In the mood section, you could write something along the lines of how the poem is depressing and really exudes a sense of pointlessness and futility. The reader is made to feel helpless as they bear witness to these soldiers dying for no real reason. It is important to note here that you might have recognised a slight overlap between the various sections in this table. This is not a coincidence, and in fact, the overlap in ideas shows how your paragraphs should link together, discussing the various features of the poem. In relation to the structure, you could write something along the lines of the fact that the lines only half rhyme, which gives a jarring feeling that what the men are going through or doing is both awkward and unpleasant. Also, the repetition of "but nothing happens" throughout the poem at the end of specific verses reminds the reader of the boredom and futility of life for the soldiers, and that this is both a pointless and useless situation for them to be in. The position of this at the end of these verses makes this all the more poignant, as it is as if the last word on the subject, and notwithstanding anything else, this is the most important thing that Owen wants the readers to realise. The soldiers are bored and nothing is happening other than they are becoming weaker and weaker due to the constant bombardment by poor weather, and this is all that will happen until they die. And to conclude, in the language section, any notes around the use of repetition, personification and rhetorical questions all build up to create a sombre and morose mood. The personification makes the weather seem to have an evil intent, and the questions act in two ways. Firstly, to draw upon the tension to the despair the soldiers feel, and also to make the reader share these feelings of helplessness, as they can do nothing but bear witness to their demise. Okay, for this lesson's final task, we will review this next lesson. You will need to write a response to the following question. How is the weather presented in the poem Exposure, and how does Owen present his attitudes towards war? Okay, so for this response you should be expecting to write 3 or 4 paragraphs, with one of them serving as an introduction. I would suggest perhaps developing what is written in the context box of your planning tables into your introductory paragraph or paragraph 1. I would then go on to talking about how the weather is personified and seems evil before moving on to a discussion of how the weather is seen as more deadly than the war, before finally talking about the repetition and significance of the line "but nothing happens." Does nothing happen, or do the soldiers die from exposure to the weather? In effect, that is what is happening. If you need a reminder of any of those paragraph starters, feel free to use the ideas in the box to the right. And of course, rewind the video to various sections to go over anything you've missed. If you are a subscriber to the Checkmate tutoring platform, you can of course submit a draft of this work and a teacher will give you some feedback on it. In any case, we will go through the sample answer in the next question. Until the next session, take care. Thank you for tuning in to Checkmate Tutors YouTube channel. Please like this video if you enjoyed the content and subscribe to the channel and click the bell to be notified when we upload further educational lessons.